All right, so I just want to, we'll talk for just a second, just a little more on the amygdala, just a little bit. The amygdala. And so in the brain, this is stuff we talked about last week, so, but I know you watched your videos this week, so you're caught up. And so the amygdala is a small part.
It doesn't hurt anymore. Small part of Israel?
Yeah, well, she didn't watch the video on guilty conscience. We'll get that one later. All right. So this is the amygdala in the limbic system, which is responsible for emotion. And there's different parts of the limbic system that are responsible for different things. Some are responsible for understanding context, right? So it's like your emotions are understood in a certain context. If you're not able to perceive the context, then your brain doesn't know which emotion to send out. And so we talked about how the amygdala is very interconnected with your frontal area, which is the neocortex, which is rational thought. That's the part that's right behind your forehead. And then you've got the stem back here, and then a lot of this is limbic system. And the amygdala is responsible for your emotions, right? And it is highly connected with the frontal cortex, right? And sometimes, if your brain decides it feels it's the right thing to do, the amygdala can hijack this, and then you have an explosion, right? Where you're operating just predominantly on your emotions, right? And then as you start to come down, then you use this a little more. Typically, it doesn't do that. I mean, just because you have an emotion, it doesn't always override your clear thinking. And in fact, like Karen's example was, if you have an emergency, sometimes the adrenaline actually causes these to work very well together. That you are very emotional, but yet you're very focused in because the situation is an emergency. But then in other times, you get in an argument with somebody and your emotions are very high, but you're not thinking at all, right? And so, but typically these work very well, and that there is a strong connection between these two, and normally this tends to override this a little bit. I mean, you don't always have emotional outbursts. So the typical way that this operates is that your prefrontal cortex works in tandem with your amygdala so that you have a balance consistently going on between emotion and rational thought. Interestingly enough, a woman's amygdala typically has more nerve endings going to the prefrontal cortex, which, no, it's actually a good thing, because it means then typically that's why women tend to be, actually less, not emotional in general, but less prone to flare-ups, because there's a stronger connection between these two that you see typically men. This is not like a across-the-board thing, but by and large, you see men being the ones who are bound to the explosive rage, right? Yeah, I know. Listen, calm down, calm down. All right, let's get our amygdalas in line. But there is a stronger connection there. So it does overall allow them to be more in touch with their emotional side, right? And have a better ability in general to control the emotion if they need to, right? It doesn't mean that they don't have their moments and that kind of stuff, but you don't see as often women just going crazy and being violent, and I mean, you see it, but by and large, if you look at the numbers of people in our prison system, it's like a 3-to-1 men to women. I mean, typically it is the male mind that is very emotionally charged, and is prone to those fits of anger and rage, and then they calm back down, which is why they make for great warriors, right? I mean, there's a reason that all the way through history that men were the battle warriors, right? So anyways.
Did not make why women are more
Yeah, it can be.
like children.
Yeah,
They need that.
yeah, the emotional connection that is there. In fact, they talk about in animals that, remember we talked about animals that don't have this at all, are the reptiles and things that eat their young. They're not capable of that emotional connection because they don't have this part of the brain. And so this is much stronger often in women, which often results in a much more nurturing, connecting, emotional kind of connection that they're seeking to have. Interestingly, with some rats who also have both of these, they somehow damaged the connection between these, you know? Yeah. Well, like some kind of surgery, right? Yeah. And so they damaged the connection there. And what they did was then they ran these rats through tests where they had something that would shock them when a tone was played, right? So the music would come first, and then the shock. And so their emotion of fear would be triggered. After a while, they learn to still be afraid when they hear the tone, even though there is no connection between the fear center and the rational thought center, which led these researchers to come to the conclusion that this part of the brain is producing its own level of thinking that is not necessarily rational thought, it is emotional types of thinking, right? And so in any given situation, both parts of your brain are sending you information. You have your rational thought and you have an emotional component to your experience. And they are not necessarily the same, and they will produce their own opinions. And so you may have an emotional reaction to someone, but then your rational part of your brain is saying, well, let's just give them a shot, you know, that kind of thing. But then something in the inside is saying, man, this person really bothers me. But then your rational thinking is saying, well, let's give them a shot. And sometimes we have that feeling in ourselves of a difference between what we feel and what we think. And so this is the foundation of what they call emotional intelligence, is the idea that there are two centers operating in your brain. One that is producing rational thought, that IQ is tested on this, but then there is the other part of your brain that is responsible for your emotional reactions, and it operates independently. And so someone could be really great here and not have developed an understanding here, and not be able to, you know, we've all seen very smart people who are socially awkward, right? Or we've seen people that everybody can get along with them, but, you know, I remember there was a guy that used to go to a church that I'm actually related to, you know, and he was a real nice guy. I mean, everybody loved him. He would come in and he'd always make pies, and it's not you, Charles. He would always make pies. I think this was before you guys got there. No, yeah, they moved away. This was a long time ago, and they're way up in age now. But he was like that type of person that everybody just loved to be around. He would always be at the front doors welcoming people as they came in. But he didn't have a high education at all, right? In fact, if you see him type, he got on Facebook the other day. I mean, he can't even spell, right? But he was such a welcoming person. Everybody loved him, and so he was very strong here, but just never had the development here, you know, for whatever reason, you know, maybe upbringing or something, you know. I think they grew up on some kind of a farm or something, you know. And so, so anyway, so that's the idea behind emotional intelligence from a brain science kind of thing, is that that you have two different things going on at any given time, and this part is responsible for producing emotion, but it is also producing its own analysis. That's what the rat thing is showing, is that they had a reaction of fear based on what this part of the brain was figuring out. Normally we think of the rational part as being the one that figures out everything, but what they're saying is that these rats with just this part figured out the connection between the sound and the pain, and so that tells them that this part of the brain was producing its own analysis, right? So in your life, you have rational thought that is producing analysis in your life, but you also have an emotional analysis where your emotions are causing you to think about things in a certain way. And so understanding this part will help you to interact with people better, because a lot of our relationships with people are reactions to this part, right? It's how this part is. And so a lot of your workplace success and relational success is not dependent just on how much you know. It's dependent on how you handle emotion and how you connect with people and how this part of the brain analyzes situations. We've all seen people that are overly defensive, right? So you take two people, one person's defensive, one's not. Somebody comes in, their boss, and starts trying to talk to them about ways to improve. The defensive person, because they don't have very strong emotional intelligence, they get defensive, they push the boss away, they retaliate against the boss, tell the boss what they think, and all of a sudden the boss has an idea about this person that they don't really like them much. Then somebody else that has a little more emotional intelligence takes the boss's criticism and says, you know what, you're right about that. I should do that. Is there anything else that you think I should be doing that you've noticed? Because I really want you to feel free to talk to me, right? That level of emotional intelligence causes them to stand out to their employer. Same scenario, but the analysis that this part of their brain is giving them is totally different. One person says, this is my boss, I can learn from them, I need to connect with them, even if I don't agree with everything they say. I need to present a good side because this is my boss. And maybe they do have some things that they can speak into my life. And what I don't want is to have conflict with them over something as simple as them just trying to help me. And so that type of analysis is going on, and so they're very outgoing, they connect, they receive it well. Somebody over here is thinking, man, I've got to prove myself here. And then the moment that the boss comes in and says something negative, they feel like, oh, I've got to prove that I'm smart, or that I can handle it, or whatever it is, that the insecurity of this part, which is fear, anger, all that stuff is generated from here. Whatever insecurity they have is affecting their emotional analysis of the situation. So we've probably all seen people that you're thinking, man, if they would just control their reactions, everybody likes them, but yet they respond sometimes in ways that push people away from them, right? And you can't hardly figure it out. You're thinking, man, why do they do that? It's not here. So if you try and talk to them and explain it away, you're not going to get very far, because the rational thought affects this. It's an emotional thing that they're dealing with, and you can't always change that. One thing that I thought was interesting, and some stuff I was looking at, is some people talk about the tipping point between positive and negative reactions in the body. So if your body feels like you're receiving something positive, you have one set of glands that are producing. Remember we talked about that this is responsible for producing fear, anxiety, and anger. And there's another whole gland system that is responsible for producing peace and love and rest. And they can't operate at the same time, basically. And so what the Bible says literally that love casts out fear is true even at this level. Well, they say there's often a tipping point when you shift from one to the other. And what causes the tipping point, so somebody's really mad, they're upset, and they're frustrated. What causes the tipping point to shift from the negative that they're caught up in to more of a positive, where they kind of calm down and they start thinking about it. You've seen that, right? And you've experienced it, I'm sure, in yourself, where you've been really mad, and then something just kind of happens, and you kind of take a breath and you start thinking about it, and you think, man, how can I, need to smooth this over a little better. I probably didn't need to be that, upset or whatever. We all have that moment. That's what they mean by the tipping point. And they say the way that you get to the tipping point is not with rational thought. Remember, because this is not a rational thing. It's not the prefrontal cortex. It's the emotional cortex. So the emotional part, they say the way that you get to the tipping point is a reduction of intensity. Right? A reduction of intensity. It's not words. So that's why when somebody's really upset and you're telling them, just calm down, what happens? They get more upset, don't they, most of the time? Because you telling them to calm down intensifies it, because now you're intense in trying to get them to calm down. And so instead of, you think it's your words, and so you throw really intense words to them, you got to calm down. And all that does is raise the intensity level, which actually raises the level of this, right? And so it's not your words, it's your calmness that will cause the intensity level to come down. And when the intensity level comes down, they get much closer to being able to experience the tip, and then all of a sudden something triggers in their brain. Which is why the Bible says, you remember what this scripture is for this, to explain this physiological phenomenon? A gentle word turns away wrath. Yeah. So it's saying a gentle word. Not just telling them to be calm, but a gentle word. It's the way you say it. Lowers the intensity. And when the intensity is lowered, it puts the emotional part of their brain in a place where it can experience the tip from negative to positive, and the other hormones that are there that can help pull them out of it begin to be able to be generated. But as long as intensity is rising, those hormones will not shift. And so the way to calm an argument, just like the Bible's been telling us, is with a gentle answer, right? But just kind of neat to see that there is an actual physical thing that is going on, and the Lord has hardwired us that way, that we are designed physically to respond in a way that His Word wants us to, right? You know, that He's trying to teach us a principle to be gentle, and that gentle is how you get out of things. So He has hardwired our bodies to literally react to gentleness, because it's not just that we're this way and so God's just trying to keep us calm. That I believe God has wired people in such a way that we are a reflection of the principles that He's trying to teach us. So He wants us to know that in His kingdom people are gentle. So we are hardwired to be at peace when people are gentle, right? And so God has hardwired us physically to reflect the principles that are in His kingdom. Yeah.
How do you explain when people say, like they're in a situation where they're going back and forth in their brain, and they'll say, I just had a gut feeling about this, I shouldn't have done this, or I knew, but like, you know what I'm talking
Right,
about?
so I would either explain that one of two ways. If they're born again and they have the Spirit of the Lord inside, a lot of times the Holy Spirit will cause you to feel uneasy about things. Like His peace is removed, and you have an uneasy feeling. So there's that. But then the other part is that this amygdala, just like rational thought can store memory, so you can learn things in rational thought, you can read a book and learn the facts from the book. Emotional memory, the emotional cortex has memory as well, right? And so your emotional part of your brain will remember things, right, that you necessarily can't put into words because it's not the rational part of your brain, but it's feelings. And so the emotional part of your brain will remember things. So if somebody treated you bad and you get around them again, you have a weird feeling around them. Because the emotional brain remembers, right? And you're not necessarily thinking about it in words, but you are remembering the emotional memories. And emotion, there is also a connection between that. So it has its own memory. This has its own memory. And then there's also a connection, so that emotion plays a major role in remembering, right? There are chemicals here that are released in highly emotional times that increase retention, and it sends out an actual signal to your memory centers to remember this because the emotion is high, right? So probably all of us remember where we were at very important moments. September 11th, you know, if somebody in your family was hurt, you remember that moment, right? It's etched in your mind, some of these things, because this part of the brain literally sends out a signal when emotion is high that triggers retention of memory in other parts of the brain. But it does have its own memory system. And sometimes this is at a more unconscious level because it's not your rational thought, it's your emotional thought, and you have had experiences like this before that your emotional brain has stored onto and remembered. So when you get in something like that again, you get a gut feeling that this is not right, because that's how your emotional brain remembers stuff. So there's that, but then there's also the Spirit that leads us. And then the Spirit can use all of this physical stuff too. You know, that if somebody's saved and they've got the Spirit of the Lord, that the Spirit will use these things to lead people as well, right? A side note, the amygdala is one of the few parts of the brain that is almost fully formed at birth, right? So in infants, they have this almost fully formed, right? Which is why nurturing of infants affects them so much, either the nurturing or the lack of it. If an infant is abandoned at an early age, you may think that they're not going to know it because their rational thought, they'll never put words to it. But this part of their brain that remembers emotional memory is remembering it right from those early years. And so if you're not spending time with them, if you're not nurturing them, they'll never grow up and be able to tell you that they remember that. But emotionally, they are now trained in a different way than someone who was nurtured, right? And so there is an emotional memory that infants have where if they're not connected with, they will end up with emotional memories of neglect that they live with from then on out, that it's very hard to get them to change that. And so they have, some kind of strange personality, or if they're abused at an early age, right, then it affects them way on out sometimes. And sometimes it takes a work of the Holy Spirit to clean that up, because they are emotionally receptive. They're emotionally damaged because they're emotionally receptive, because that part of their brain's up and functioning, the emotional part. And so that's why, singing to them, talking to them, physical touch with infants, anything that creates an emotional connection will start forming them to be confident here, right? And that's really what you want, is to create in them at a young age a feeling of confidence. That's why child abuse is so damaging to them down the road. I mean, they could be 20 years later and still have insecurity and things like that they carry with them, because it's not this part that was affected. Because you try and talk to them, hey, you're past it, you're an adult now, why are you still even thinking about that stuff? And they still carry it with them because it's not rational thought, it's the emotional memory center that is affected. Okay. All right. I want to go on and finish. Well, let me give you two other things with brain stuff. One, whenever stress is in the body, it produces, you know what the chemical is? That cortisol. Your body produces cortisol. That is the stress hormone. And you actually can. And in fact, if cortisol stays in the body too long, like if you stay stressed in a stressful environment too long, it keeps this part of your brain, the emotional part, constantly charged, right? And so that's why people that are depressed and stressed always seem so emotional. They're always ready to cry or to blow up or to self-implode or something. They're very emotional because cortisol is an emotional one here, and it keeps them off of this, right? That's why sometimes people that are depressed do things that you're thinking, man, why did you do that? And then later they look back on it and think, why did I do that? It doesn't make sense because they're being emotionally driven. And so what they found in children is that if they're in stressful situations for too long in childhood, so they're in a home where they're not loved, where there's not much food, there's not that much stuff, the cortisol level stays high, which means this part does not develop the way that it should because this stays energized. And so you get a lot of children that literally have learning disabilities because of the stressful environment that they grew up in, that the cortisol level stays so high in their body that this part never shuts down enough to let this part fully function, because you can't have both. So cortisol is the stress hormone that causes you your emotions to engage, and so kids that grow up in abusive homes and things like that often end up with learning disabilities too. Doesn't mean they can't maybe work out of it later, but if they're exposed to it for too long, it literally causes their brain to not retain information the way that somebody else's would. And so, if you're teaching younger kids who are consistently in bad environments, not all of them, some of them display an amazing emotional maturity and are able to fight through it. But a lot of them that come from stressful backgrounds end up living emotionally charged adolescent years, as opposed to thinking, and being able to develop well in that. And they all do to a certain extent, but that cortisol at a young age is very damaging.
I think that's why there's such a system of never breaking a cycle.
Yeah.
Grandmother, passing it on to the daughter passing it on to the granddaughter.
Yeah, because the stress that the parent creates
Never gets,
keeps the child from being able to develop.
they never really mature themselves, so they can't really pass it
Yeah,
on.
yeah, and they keep them in these stressful environments, and so they learn a level of street smarts that's very emotionally driven, but not the academic part of the rational brain, because they stay in high stressful environments for too long, so.
I think that really causes a lot of havoc because the rational part of the brain doesn't even finish growing, you said, until like 20, 22, 23?
Yeah, well, so already this part is trying to emerge, right? Because that's the natural development process, that teenagers are not fully developed here, which is why they often do things that don't make sense. But if this stays fully charged, then this is not developing in the way that it should. And so it may physically develop, right? I mean, their brain is not going to be like stunted in terms of size, but the connections that the chemicals are designed to produce, the intellectual connections don't form at the same rate, And so it's something to think about in terms of how we raise, how we stress. I knew someone one time, true story, who was stressed out, like to the max, stressed out. Deep depression, and a lot of it was connected with some medicines and things like that. Totally, not thinking coherently. I mean, not crazy, but man, just almost desperate. They were so stressed. I got them to take a cortisol blocker, right? And within a month, they were back to themselves again. And so they sell this, particularly in weightlifting, like GNCs and places like that. Your weightlifting supplies, they will sell this because sometimes there's a connection between this and testosterone too, and different things like that. And so some guys that weightlift get better results if they block this, right? Because when one hormone goes high, then sometimes the other ones do too. So when you're weightlifting, sometimes you get, with your higher levels of testosterone, you get higher levels of other things. And so sometimes to get better results, they will take a cortisol blocker that frees up more room for just the testosterone, so they hold on to more weight. So anyway, so you can get these at GNC and places like that. But it's just interesting. Yeah, well, I don't know. I can't recommend that one.
My first question, my first thought is like, well, if it blocks it, where does it go? I don't know if it ends up somewhere else.
Yeah, no, it stops the production of it. Yeah. I think a lot of what it is it's I think it binds to it. So the free cortisol in your system, it binds to it, and then you just get rid of it. Before I take anything they say at GNC, I would make sure it's not like a testosterone booster with the cortisol. You know what I'm saying? You might trade stress for a
Sean said I should.
yeah. So yeah, I would definitely, but I just think that that's interesting how that person, they were blaming everything around them, which is a common experience during depression, is everything around me is causing me to be this way. And they took the cortisol blocker, got themselves back to a fresh start, and then they saw their situation a little differently, they were able to cope a little better. But it's just interesting that this doesn't necessarily go away on its own sometimes, that sometimes people have to intentionally put themselves in some positive environments to start generating the counter hormones to this, right? That's why sometimes if somebody's depressed, it's good for them to take a vacation. And just in the getting away from everything, their brain will start to reset. Because there is a difference between rest and renewal. And that's important. That's an important concept for recharging yourself, right? Is that rest and renewal are not the same thing. If somebody's really depressed, they could sleep all day, and they're still not mentally fixed. Physically, maybe they're a little better off, but there's a difference between rest and renewal. And sometimes we assume in our life that if we just made sure we got enough sleep, that we will be fine. But sleep, rest activities and renewal activities are often different. So everybody has something that helps them to renew, and sometimes it's different. So for me, getting away and reading or going on a walk are two things that I like to do that help me to renew. I could feel better off of going off by myself and reading for a few hours than I would from taking a nap, because there's a difference between rest. Now, sometimes your body physically needs more rest, and that's something up here. But don't make the mistake of thinking that you can stay recharged mentally as long as you got enough sleep. That there are renewal activities, and as a leader, I kind of had this in my emotional intelligence / leadership section, but we can talk about it a little now, that you need to know that you have to make sure your people are doing this, because if all they're doing is getting rest and you're not creating opportunities for renewal, letting them go to a convention, giving them some time to just spend with their family or things like that, then they're not going to be mentally strengthened. And so anyways, in your own private time, you need to make sure that you are scheduling things that produce renewal, right? Because then otherwise, you will be mentally tired and can't figure it out. Because you're thinking, man, I'm sleeping more and more and more, but I still feel mentally tired. Because you're getting rest without renewal. And there's a whole bunch of people that go around mislabeling what they're feeling. And they're like, oh man, I'm just run down. I can't ever seem to catch up on my sleep. And they're mislabeling it because they think they need more rest. But it's really this, right? And that's why getting more and more rest and sleeping in and going to bed earlier isn't helping them. And they just feel exhausted because they need renewal, right?
And plus, people who are truly depressed, that's all they end up doing is that they don't want to get out of bed.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it could be counterproductive, that getting too much of this will shut this off, because then you feel even less productive and even less close to whatever breakthrough you're expecting or whatever it is that they have defined in their mind as success that they're not getting, So anyway, it's just kind of interesting that sometimes if you're dealing with someone who is worn down, that they really need renewal type things. Go away on a vacation, find a book, find a hobby that you like to do that has nothing to do with the rest of your stuff, and engage in that, and it will start a renewal process in your mind that will cause you to start coming out of whatever, depression or frustration or just, weariness that has set in, right?